The day someone decides you're worthless is often the day your real story begins. Malcolm Brooks never imagined the quiet sound of a pen sliding across polished oak could echo louder than every promise he and Vanessa had ever made. The attorney carefully turned the final page toward him, while late afternoon sunlight spilled through the office windows, stretching long golden lines across the table where two wedding rings no longer rested together. Vanessa sat across from him wearing the same calm expression she used whenever she had already made up her mind. There were no raised voices, no dramatic accusations, only a silence that somehow carried more weight than anger ever could. 3 months earlier, Malcolm had lost the engineering job he believed would support their future. The company downsized without warning, and his position disappeared with hundreds of others. Every morning afterward became another cycle of applications, interviews that ended with polite rejection emails, and long drives home calculating how many dollars remained before another bill arrived. He never stopped trying. He repaired neighbors' appliances, delivered groceries across town, drove rideshare on weekends, and accepted every honest opportunity that came his way. But effort did not always produce immediate results, and eventually the savings account they had spent years building began shrinking faster than hope could refill it. Vanessa watched the numbers disappear, and somewhere along the way she stopped seeing the man beside her and started seeing only the uncertainty in front of her. She folded her hands together and looked directly into his eyes. "I can't build my future around someone who keeps falling behind," she said quietly. Malcolm searched her face, hoping to find even the smallest sign that fear had spoken louder than love. Instead, he found certainty. He lowered his eyes to the divorce papers. The black ink waiting for his signature looked strangely permanent, almost colder than the air-conditioned office surrounding them. He wanted to explain that failure was temporary, that one season should never define an entire life, but the words refused to come. Pride was useless in that room. Excuses were even less valuable. So he signed. The attorney gathered the documents, offered a professional nod, and quietly stepped outside to give them one final moment alone. Vanessa stood first, smoothing the sleeve of her blazer before reaching for her purse. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she said without bitterness. Malcolm gave a faint smile that barely reached his tired eyes. "I hope you do too." She hesitated for only a second before walking toward the door. Her footsteps faded down the hallway until the building became completely silent. Malcolm remained seated, staring at the empty chair where the woman he had loved only moments earlier had been sitting. Outside, traffic moved through downtown Chicago as if nothing important had happened. People laughed on the sidewalks. A city bus hissed to a stop. Somewhere, life continued exactly as it always had. Malcolm finally stood, picked up the worn leather folder holding the only legal proof that his marriage had ended, and walked into the cooling evening air carrying little more than a few personal belongings and the weight of starting over. He didn't know it yet, but this wasn't the end of his story. It was simply the last chapter anyone around him believed they would ever need to read. 3 years later, Malcolm Brooks woke up before sunrise in the front seat of a 12-year-old sedan parked beside a 24-hour grocery store on the edge of Chicago. The early morning air had left a thin layer of moisture on the windshield, softening the glow of the streetlights into blurred circles of yellow. He stretched carefully, folded the worn blanket resting behind his seat, and checked the time on his phone. 4:48 in the morning. Another day had begun before most people even opened their eyes. His apartment had become impossible to afford months after the divorce, and the old car slowly transformed into the only place he could call home. He never allowed himself to think of it as failure. It was simply a temporary address. Every dollar he earned had a destination before it ever reached his pocket. Gasoline. Insurance. A prepaid phone bill. Cheap meals. A small savings account that grew by only a few dollars each week. He refused to let even one unnecessary purchase steal from the future he still believed existed somewhere beyond the horizon. By 6 o'clock he was delivering breakfast orders across the city. Before noon he repaired a neighbor's broken washing machine for cash. During the afternoon he helped unload construction materials at a warehouse outside downtown, and after sunset he drove passengers through quiet neighborhoods until midnight. His hands grew rougher every month, but his determination became smoother, calmer, and harder to shake. There were evenings when exhaustion settled into his bones so deeply that even climbing back into the driver's seat felt like another full-time job. Yet every morning he started again without complaint. The hardest part was not the physical work. It was watching former classmates announce promotions, vacations, and new homes while his own victories were measured by finding gasoline 5 cents cheaper per gallon or managing to save another $20 before the end of the week. Even then, Malcolm never blamed anyone else for his circumstances. Life had changed. That was all. One rainy Thursday afternoon he stopped inside the public library to escape the weather for a few minutes before his next delivery. The familiar smell of old books and fresh coffee drifted through the quiet building. He opened his laptop and continued editing a software prototype he had been building whenever time allowed. It had become a nightly ritual that nobody knew about. Hundreds of hours had disappeared into lines of code written from borrowed tables, coffee shops, and parking lots illuminated only by the dim light above his steering wheel. Most people would have called it a hobby. Malcolm treated it like a promise to himself. As he reviewed another section of the program, a voice behind him interrupted the silence. "Malcolm Brooks?" He turned and immediately recognized Professor Daniel Whitaker, the engineering professor who had challenged him more than anyone during college. The older man smiled with genuine surprise before extending his hand. "I almost did not recognize you, but I would know that level of concentration anywhere." Malcolm smiled politely and shook his hand. They talked for several minutes about life, work, and the years that had quietly passed. Malcolm never mentioned sleeping in his car. He simply said he was working on a personal project between jobs. Professor Whitaker asked one final question before leaving. "Would you be willing to show me what you are building?" Malcolm hesitated for only a heartbeat before rotating the laptop toward him. He had no idea that this simple conversation inside a quiet public library was about to become the first real doorway leading away from everything he had been surviving and toward everything he had almost stopped believing was possible. Professor Daniel Whitaker remained silent for nearly 5 minutes as he studied the software running across Malcolm Brooks's laptop screen. He clicked through menus, tested features, and occasionally raised one eyebrow without saying a word. Around them, people quietly flipped pages inside the library while rain continued tapping against the windows. Malcolm sat patiently, trying not to read too much into the professor's expression. After years of rejection letters and polite conversations that always ended with disappointment, he had learned not to expect good news too quickly. Finally, Professor Whitaker closed the laptop halfway and looked directly at him. "You built all of this by yourself?" Malcolm nodded. "Mostly at night. Whenever I finished work." The professor leaned back in his chair, shaking his head with quiet disbelief. "Do you realize what you have here?" Malcolm gave a small smile. "Something that still needs a lot of work." Professor Whitaker laughed softly. "That answer tells me you have not changed since college." Before Malcolm could respond, the professor reached into his briefcase and pulled out a business card. The name printed beneath the university logo was followed by another title Malcolm had never seen before: Senior Technology Advisor, Horizon Dynamics. It was a private research company partnering with several major engineering firms across the country. "We are assembling a small innovation team," Professor Whitaker explained. "Most applicants have impressive resumes. Very few have real persistence. I believe persistence is harder to teach than talent." Malcolm accepted the card carefully, almost afraid to bend its edges. "I appreciate that, but I have been out of the industry for years." "Exactly," the professor replied. "And yet you kept building anyway. Most people stop creating when nobody is watching. You did not." 2 days later, Malcolm walked into the Horizon Dynamics office wearing the only suit he still owned. It had been pressed carefully the night before at a neighborhood laundromat, but the sleeves showed their age, and the shoes had been polished enough times that the leather had begun to lose its original color. He noticed expensive watches, tailored jackets, and confident conversations filling the lobby. For a brief moment he wondered whether he truly belonged there. Then he remembered every sunrise inside his car, every delivery route, every late-night writing code beneath a parking lot light, and he straightened his shoulders. The interview lasted almost 3 hours. Instead of asking about the employment gap on his resume, the engineers asked him to solve real problems. Malcolm filled whiteboards with diagrams, explained algorithms in simple language, admitted when he did not know an answer, and immediately proposed how he would find one. By the end of the afternoon, the atmosphere inside the room had changed. They were no longer interviewing an unemployed applicant. They were discussing ideas with another engineer. 3 days later, his phone rang while he was delivering grocery orders. He parked beside a quiet neighborhood park before answering. "Malcolm," Professor Whitaker said warmly. "Welcome to Horizon Dynamics." Malcolm closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the words to settle into the silence around him. The salary was modest compared to large technology companies, but it was more money than he had earned in years, and more importantly, it was a chance to build something that mattered. As he looked through the windshield at children laughing across the green field, he realized that opportunity rarely arrived wearing the clothes people expected. Sometimes it arrived as a single phone call that quietly divided an ordinary life into everything that came before and everything that came next. Far across the city, completely unaware that Malcolm's future had just begun to change, Vanessa Brooks continued living her life, never imagining that the man she had once believed was falling behind had finally stepped onto the road that would one day place his name before the entire nation. The first 6 months at Horizon Dynamics tested Malcolm Brooks in ways unemployment never had. During the day, he worked beside engineers whose resumes were filled with prestigious companies and advanced research projects. At night, he returned to a modest studio apartment that he could finally afford after leaving his car behind, opened the same laptop that had carried him through his hardest years, and continued refining ideas that nobody had asked him to build. Every morning he arrived before sunrise with a cup of inexpensive coffee and a notebook already filled with sketches. Every evening he was usually one of the last people to leave. Success did not arrive as a dramatic breakthrough. It came disguised as ordinary discipline repeated hundreds of times. His first proposal was rejected because the software needed better scalability. The second version solved one problem but created another. Weeks of testing revealed flaws that forced the team to start over more than once. Some employees grew frustrated whenever another deadline moved farther away. Malcolm quietly erased whiteboards, rewrote thousands of lines of code, and treated every mistake as another lesson instead of another defeat. Professor Daniel Whitaker often noticed him sitting alone in the conference room after everyone else had gone home, studying performance reports with the same determination he once used inside the public library. One evening, the professor placed another cup of coffee beside him and smiled. "Most people chase recognition," he said. "You chase improvement. That difference changes lives." Malcolm simply nodded before returning to his work. He had learned years earlier that applause was temporary, but growth could remain forever. Seasons passed almost unnoticed. Winter snow gave way to spring rain, and spring slowly welcomed another warm Chicago summer. The project evolved into something far larger than anyone had expected. Their technology reduced processing time for industrial systems by nearly 40% during early testing, attracting attention from companies that had previously ignored Horizon Dynamics. Investors began requesting demonstrations. Executives who had never heard Malcolm's name suddenly wanted him leading technical presentations because he understood every detail of the platform better than anyone else. Even then, he never spoke about his past. He never mentioned sleeping in a car or delivering groceries before sunrise. His work introduced him long before his history ever could. Across town, Vanessa Brooks continued building the comfortable life she had chosen after the divorce. Her social media pages displayed vacations, elegant restaurants, and carefully framed celebrations with colleagues. Occasionally she heard someone mention a growing technology company called Horizon Dynamics, but the name meant nothing to her. She never asked who worked there, and she never imagined Malcolm's life had moved in a direction completely different from the one she had predicted. One crisp October afternoon, the executive team gathered inside the company's largest conference room. A representative from a major New York investment firm had just finished reviewing 6 months of performance data. The room remained unusually quiet as everyone waited for the final decision. The representative slowly closed the presentation folder, smiled across the table, and extended his hand toward the company's leadership. "Congratulations," he said. "We are prepared to move forward with a multi-million-dollar investment." For a brief moment nobody spoke. Then the room erupted into relieved laughter, grateful handshakes, and quiet celebrations. Malcolm stood near the window looking out across the Chicago skyline as the afternoon sunlight reflected from hundreds of glass buildings. He did not raise his arms in victory. He did not call anyone to boast. Instead, he took one slow breath and remembered the lonely parking lot where he had once promised himself that temporary hardship would never become a permanent identity. Before the meeting ended, the chief executive officer walked over with unexpected news. "Malcolm," she said, "our investors in New York have requested something very specific. They want you to lead the national product launch yourself." Malcolm Brooks accepted the invitation to New York with the same quiet gratitude that had carried him through every difficult season before it. The flight itself felt almost unreal. Only a few years earlier he had measured every gallon of gasoline before accepting another delivery route. Now he sat beside the window watching clouds drift beneath the wings while reviewing presentation notes instead of overdue bills. Yet success had not changed the habits that hardship had taught him. He still arrived early. He still listened more than he spoke. He still believed preparation was a form of respect. The national product launch was held inside a modern conference center overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Technology journalists, business executives, investors, and industry leaders filled the auditorium long before the event officially began. Bright studio lights reflected from enormous digital displays while camera crews quietly adjusted equipment for the live broadcast that would later air across major news networks. Malcolm stood backstage wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit that Horizon Dynamics had insisted on purchasing for him. As he adjusted his tie, he caught his own reflection in a nearby mirror. For a brief second he remembered the man who had once pressed an aging suit inside a laundromat before his first interview. The face looking back at him carried more confidence now, but the eyes were exactly the same. Professor Daniel Whitaker stepped beside him with a warm smile. "Nervous?" he asked. Malcolm laughed softly. "A little." The professor nodded. "Good. That means you still care." When the event began, the chief executive officer introduced Horizon Dynamics and explained how years of research had led to a breakthrough that could improve industrial efficiency across multiple sectors. Then she paused, looked toward the side of the stage, and smiled. "Every great innovation begins with someone willing to keep building long after everyone else stops believing. Please welcome the engineer whose vision helped make all of this possible, Malcolm Brooks." The audience responded with warm applause as Malcolm walked beneath the lights. He thanked everyone for attending and spoke with calm confidence about solving practical problems through persistence, teamwork, and responsible innovation. He never exaggerated the company's achievements. He never tried to impress the audience with complicated language. Instead, he explained difficult ideas in a way that anyone could understand. By the time he finished, the applause was louder than before. Not because he had performed like a celebrity, but because he had spoken like someone who genuinely believed progress should improve ordinary lives. The presentation spread quickly beyond the conference hall. Technology websites published articles within hours. Business magazines requested interviews. Television producers called Horizon Dynamics asking for Malcolm to appear on upcoming programs discussing innovation and economic growth. His name, once known only by a handful of coworkers, quietly began appearing across headlines, professional newsletters, and financial reports. Friends from college sent congratulatory messages after recognizing him online. Former colleagues reached out to reconnect. Malcolm appreciated every kind word, yet he never searched for Vanessa Brooks. He never wondered whether she had heard his name or seen his photograph. Some chapters only remain painful if a person keeps reopening the book. Malcolm had already turned the page. Late that evening, As the Horizon Dynamics team celebrated with a simple dinner overlooking the city, the chief executive officer received a phone call from one of the nation's largest television networks. After listening for a moment, she smiled across the table before placing the phone down. "They want Malcolm for an exclusive live interview next Friday evening," she said. "Not just the company. They specifically asked for him." Hundreds of miles away in Chicago, completely unaware of the invitation that had just been accepted, Vanessa was already making plans to spend the following Friday night at home in front of her television. Friday arrived with clear autumn skies stretching above New York, and the television studio hummed with quiet precision long before the cameras began broadcasting across the country. Producers walked quickly between bright stages, makeup artists made final adjustments beneath warm lights, and technicians counted down rehearsals while giant digital screens displayed the Horizon Dynamics logo beside Malcolm Brooks's name. He sat comfortably in a chair just outside the studio, reviewing a few handwritten notes that barely filled half a page. Unlike many guests who memorized polished speeches, Malcolm only wanted to remember one thing: speak honestly. Everything else would take care of itself. A producer approached him with a welcoming smile and explained the schedule one last time. The interview would open with the company's breakthrough, followed by questions about innovation, leadership, and the personal journey behind his success. Malcolm thanked her, folded the notebook, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. He had spent years learning that preparation created confidence, but authenticity created trust. Back in Chicago, the evening unfolded like any other for Vanessa Brooks. After finishing work, she stopped by a neighborhood grocery store, picked up fresh salad, sparkling water, and a small dessert, then returned to her apartment just before sunset. She changed into comfortable clothes, placed dinner on a tray, and turned on the television more out of habit than intention. A commercial break filled the screen before the network anchor appeared with an enthusiastic smile. "Tonight," he announced, "we sit down with one of the brightest engineering minds behind one of the fastest-growing technology companies in America. Stay with us for an exclusive conversation you will not want to miss." Vanessa barely looked up. Technology interviews had never interested her. She reached for her phone instead, casually scrolling through messages while the program continued in the background. Hundreds of miles away, the studio lights brightened as the countdown echoed through Malcolm's earpiece. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The host welcomed viewers from across the nation before introducing the remarkable growth of Horizon Dynamics and the impact its technology was already making across several industries. Large images of research laboratories, engineering teams, and advanced manufacturing facilities appeared behind the stage while the audience applauded politely. Malcolm walked onto the set with calm confidence, shaking the host's hand before taking his seat beneath the lights. There was nothing flashy about the moment. No dramatic entrance. No expensive display meant to impress viewers. He simply looked like a man completely comfortable with the person he had become. The conversation began with questions about innovation, teamwork, and perseverance. Malcolm answered thoughtfully, giving credit to his colleagues, his mentors, and the countless hours shared by people whose names would never appear in headlines. His humility surprised the audience as much as his expertise. Social media quickly filled with comments praising not only the technology but also the quiet confidence of the engineer explaining it. News websites started publishing clips from the interview before the broadcast had even finished. In apartments, restaurants, airport lounges, and living rooms across the country, people who had never heard Malcolm Brooks's name before suddenly found themselves listening carefully to every word he said. In Chicago, Vanessa finally placed her phone on the coffee table after hearing the host say, "Please welcome Malcolm Brooks." The name sounded strangely familiar. She slowly turned her eyes toward the television just as the camera shifted into a close view of the guest's face. The fork slipped quietly from her hand onto the dinner plate, and for several long seconds she forgot to breathe. Vanessa Brooks could not look away from the television. The familiar smile, the steady voice, and the quiet confidence belonged to the same man she had once watched leave their attorney's office carrying nothing but a worn leather folder and an uncertain future. Yet, Everything else seemed transformed. Malcolm did not speak like someone trying to prove his worth. He spoke like someone who no longer measured his value through the opinions of others. The host smiled and asked what had inspired him to continue after facing professional setbacks. Malcolm paused for a brief moment before answering. "Life has a way of asking difficult questions," he said calmly. "Sometimes the answer is not giving up. Sometimes the answer is becoming the person your hardest season was trying to build." The audience applauded softly. Vanessa barely heard them. Memories she had carefully packed away over the years began returning one after another. She remembered the countless mornings Malcolm left before sunrise searching for work. She remembered him fixing neighbors' appliances without complaining. She remembered unopened bills stacked neatly on the kitchen counter because he refused to ignore reality. She also remembered the day she convinced herself that leaving was the only practical decision. At the time it had felt reasonable. Watching him now, certainty slowly gave way to uncomfortable questions she had never allowed herself to ask. What if he had only needed more time? What if she had mistaken a temporary struggle for a permanent future? Across the country, the interview continued. The host displayed photographs from Horizon Dynamics research facilities and explained how the company's technology was attracting attention from manufacturers throughout the United States. Malcolm accepted every compliment with humility before redirecting the praise toward his colleagues. "Innovation is never created by one person," he said. "Every breakthrough stands on the shoulders of people willing to solve problems together." The comment quickly spread across social media. Viewers admired not only his intelligence but also his character. News commentators described him as a refreshing example of thoughtful leadership. Former classmates shared clips of the interview online, adding messages about how hardworking Malcolm had always been. His name climbed across trending business topics before the broadcast even ended. Vanessa's phone suddenly vibrated on the coffee table. A friend had sent a message containing a screenshot from the interview with only one sentence beneath it. "Is this not your ex-husband?" Vanessa stared at the message without replying. A second notification appeared only moments later. Then another. People who had not spoken to her in years were reaching out with the same surprised question. She quietly muted her phone and turned her attention back to the television. The host leaned forward for one final question. "If you could speak to the younger version of yourself during your hardest days, what would you tell him?" Malcolm smiled gently before answering. "I would tell him not to rush the story. The chapters that feel like endings are often only the beginning of something greater. Keep doing honest work. Keep learning. The right opportunities usually arrive after you have become ready to receive them." Vanessa felt her eyes fill with emotion, not because Malcolm sounded angry, but because he did not. There was no bitterness hidden beneath his words. No desire to embarrass anyone. No attempt to rewrite history. He had simply continued living while she had continued assuming his story ended where she had left it. As the interview concluded, the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Malcolm thanked everyone with the same quiet smile he had carried throughout the evening before walking off the stage beneath bright studio lights. Vanessa remained motionless in her apartment long after the credits began rolling. For the first time since signing those divorce papers years earlier, she realized she had not left behind a man without a future. She had walked away from a future she had been too impatient to wait for. The following Monday morning, after a weekend filled with headlines praising Malcolm Brooks, Vanessa made a decision she could no longer ignore. She was going to find him. The following Monday morning, Vanessa Brooks stood across the street from the headquarters of Horizon Dynamics, gripping a paper coffee cup that had long since grown cold. Employees streamed through the revolving glass doors carrying laptops, greeting one another with relaxed confidence before disappearing into the bright lobby. She had driven past the building twice before finding the courage to park. During the entire weekend she had replayed Malcolm's interview over and over, searching for signs of resentment that might justify the guilt growing inside her. She never found any. Instead she saw the same quiet man she had once known, only stronger, steadier, and completely at peace with himself. After taking one slow breath, she crossed the street and entered the building. The receptionist welcomed her with a warm smile. "Good morning. How may I help you?" Vanessa hesitated for a moment before answering. "I was hoping to speak with Malcolm Brooks. We knew each other years ago." The receptionist checked the schedule on her computer before looking back politely. "Mr. Brooks has a meeting in about 20 minutes. May I let him know who is here?" Vanessa lowered her eyes briefly before replying. "Please tell him Vanessa Brooks is waiting." The receptionist nodded and disappeared toward the elevators. Several minutes later, the elevator doors opened, and Malcolm stepped into the lobby wearing a charcoal suit with a simple blue tie. He carried a tablet beneath one arm and greeted coworkers by name as he walked. When he finally noticed Vanessa, he slowed naturally, offering the same calm expression he seemed to offer everyone else. There was no shock. No visible anger. Only quiet recognition. "Vanessa," he said gently. "It has been a long time." She managed a nervous smile. "It really has." Malcolm glanced toward a seating area beside the windows. "We have a few minutes. Would you like to sit?" They settled into two chairs overlooking the city skyline. Morning sunlight reflected across the polished floor while employees passed by without interrupting them. For several seconds neither spoke. Finally, Vanessa folded her hands together. "I watched your interview," she said softly. "I almost did not recognize you." Malcolm smiled faintly. "Life has changed." She nodded. "More than I ever imagined." The silence returned, heavier now but no longer uncomfortable. Vanessa looked at him carefully before speaking again. "I owe you an apology. Back then I convinced myself I was making the practical decision. I kept telling myself that our future had disappeared. Watching you on television made me realize something I should have understood years ago. You were never finished becoming the man you are today. I just stopped believing before the story was over." Malcolm listened without interrupting. He did not rush to respond or attempt to soften her words. When she finished, he rested his hands calmly on his knees and looked out toward the skyline for a moment. "Those years taught me many things," he said quietly. "One of them was that people make decisions based on what they can see at the time. I cannot change what happened, and honestly, I no longer wish to." Vanessa felt both relief and sadness in the kindness of his answer. "Do you ever regret any of it?" she asked. Malcolm thought carefully before replying. "I regret the pain. I do not regret the growth. If life had followed the path I expected, I might never have discovered what I was capable of becoming." His words carried no accusation, only simple truth. At that moment, Malcolm's assistant approached respectfully and reminded him that the executive meeting would begin in 5 minutes. Malcolm stood, smiled warmly at Vanessa, and extended his hand. She accepted it, surprised that such an ordinary gesture could carry so much grace. Before turning toward the elevators, he said one final sentence that stayed with her long after he disappeared from view. "You did not leave because I had no value. You left before my value became visible, and those are two very different things." Vanessa remained seated in the lobby long after Malcolm disappeared behind the elevator doors. Around her, conversations continued, phones rang softly, and employees hurried toward meetings that would shape the future of a growing company, yet everything felt strangely quiet. She realized that the most important conversation she would have that day had already ended. There had been no dramatic confrontation, no harsh words, and no attempt to make her feel guilty. Malcolm had offered something far more difficult than revenge. He had offered peace. As she walked back onto the busy Chicago sidewalk, the cool breeze carried the sounds of the city around her, but her thoughts stayed with one simple truth. She had spent years believing success would change a person's character. Instead, she had witnessed that true success revealed it. Malcolm had not become kind because he had earned recognition. He had remained kind even after life finally recognized him. Meanwhile, Malcolm entered the executive meeting with the same quiet focus he had shown every day since joining Horizon Dynamics. Contracts were reviewed, expansion plans were discussed, and new partnerships promised opportunities that once seemed impossible. Yet despite everything changing around him, He never forgot the years when every dollar mattered and every opportunity required faith before there was evidence. A few months later, Horizon Dynamics announced the opening of a scholarship program for engineering students from families facing financial hardship. Malcolm personally insisted that academic potential should matter more than perfect circumstances. During the first awards ceremony, he stood before a room filled with young students and families who reminded him of his own past. Looking across their hopeful faces, he smiled and said, "Do not measure your future by the chapter you are living today. Your circumstances may introduce you, but your choices will define you." The room answered with warm applause, not because the words were dramatic, but because they were sincere. News organizations covered the scholarship program, praising the company for investing in future innovators instead of only celebrating current success. Malcolm accepted the attention only long enough to redirect it toward the students whose journeys were just beginning. He had learned that the greatest reward was not being seen. It was creating opportunities for someone else to be seen. Vanessa occasionally followed those stories from a distance. She never attempted another unexpected visit, and Malcolm never reached out to reopen a chapter they had both already finished. Time slowly transformed regret into understanding. She eventually recognized that forgiveness is not always receiving another chance. Sometimes forgiveness is simply being allowed to leave the past without carrying bitterness forever. On a bright spring afternoon, nearly 4 years after the divorce papers had been signed, Malcolm walked through a neighborhood park after speaking at a local community event. Families laughed beneath blooming trees, children chased one another across open fields, and sunlight reflected gently from the nearby lake. He paused for a moment, breathing in the fresh air with quiet gratitude. The expensive suit, the national interviews, and the professional recognition were meaningful, but they were never the destination. The real victory had arrived much earlier, on the day he decided that disappointment would not become his identity. He smiled to himself before continuing down the path, unhurried and completely at peace. Somewhere else in the same city, Vanessa looked up from a newspaper featuring another article about Horizon Dynamics. She smiled gently, folded the page, and whispered words that only she could hear. "I am glad you kept going." Malcolm never heard them, and he did not need to. Some victories do not require an audience. Some apologies do not require an answer. The strongest form of success is not making someone wish they had stayed. It is becoming someone who no longer needs them to. Malcolm did not win because the world finally applauded him. He won because he never allowed the hardest season of his life to become the final sentence of his story.